Welcome, welcome everyone. It's your girl Marcy Thomas here for another episode of the BGC Book Club. So come on in the room and let's get it started. I am super excited for tonight's special guest. Actually, we have been in communication for several months now. Actually, she reached out to me a while ago saying, hey, I've got this wonderful book of poetry coming out and I would love to come on and be a part of your book club audience, share my story with your book club audience. So she is here and I can't wait to get started. So as you're coming in the room, if you don't mind letting us know where you're joining us from, that would be wonderful. Once again, I'm Marcy Thomas, founder of the BGC Book Club and of course Brown Girl Collective. The collective has been around for just about 13 and a half years. BGC Book Club has been around since the pandemic. So it's super exciting for me to always have a chance to talk with wonderful Black women writers, and today is no exception. And we're going to be talking about Concentrate. That light's a little off, but this is a wonderful book of poetry with a beautiful photograph on the cover, which we'll get into here in just a moment. So as a means of introduction, let me tell you a little bit about tonight's guest. We have with us Courtney Faye Taylor, who is a writer and visual artist. She is the author of Concentrate, which was published by Grey Wolf Press earlier this month. It is the winner of the 2021 Canem Poetry Prize, selected by Rachel Eliza Griffiths, and was a finalist for the National Poetry Series. Courtney earned her BA from Agnes Scott College here in Atlanta, where I am, and her MFA from the University of Michigan Helen Zell Writers Program, where she received the Hopwood Prize in Poetry. She is also the winner of the 92 Y Discovery Prize and an Academy of American Poets Prize. The recipient of residencies and fellowships from Canem and the Charlotte Street Foundation. Courtney's work can be found in Poetry Magazine, The Nation, Plowshares, Best New Poets, The New Republic, and elsewhere. And without any further delay, let's go ahead and welcome Courtney into the space. Welcome, Courtney.
You so much for having me. Very excited to be here.
Oh yes, I'm so excited, super excited to have you here. And you are very good at what you do. So it's always exciting to have people who are excellent at their craft come in and join us to talk about their work.
Thank you.
So of course I want to congratulate you on winning the prize, of course. So tell us a little bit about what that process was like.
Yeah, so I had been working on this book in its current state for about 2 years before I won the prize.
Okay.
There are some poems in this book that existed in a previous manuscript that I was writing about a completely different topic, but there were a lot of poems about Black girlhood. And so I basically migrated those poems into this new collection where I was really interested in the relationship between Black and Asian American communities, Latasha Harlins, sexual assault, all these different topics. And so in 2019, I'd say I really kind of started to formulate this book. Mm-hmm. And from there, it won the Canem Prize in 2021.
All right. Well, that's super exciting. And, the book itself, it is a combination of poetry, it is prose, it is also art. So, we're going to get into that because that's unique. And a lot of times when people have works and if there is art in it, it isn't the art of the person who actually wrote the words as well. So in putting the book together, did the art kind of inform the poetry or the other way around?
Yeah, it was an interesting process because at first there was no art in the book. I was working on submitting my book to a prize. It was sometime in 2019. And in like the night before the deadline, I started working on a visual poem. That's kind of what I consider the visual elements in the book to be. And it was the poem in the book with the faces of Black women and girls. Mm-hmm. And I had just come across missing persons flyers, the FBI's most wanted list, and was just kind of seeing how Black women and girls were depicted on those flyers, how they were discussed. And so I was just interested in that form. And so I started taking faces and words from those flyers and kind of compiling them into a collage. And so that was the first poem, the first visual poem that was in the book. And from there, I started to think about other places where visuals could communicate something that poetry couldn't. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I think an image just says way more than I could possibly say with anything that I would write. And so I kind of think of the visual art and my words working in tandem to tell this fuller story. Mhm.
Absolutely, and it does that for sure. Like collage work and things like that, and it's very beautiful and poignant to the story that's being told. So, for those who haven't had a chance to read your wonderful poetry yet, tell us a little bit about what Concentrate is about.
Yeah, so I think when people read it, the central story that's there is about Latasha Harlins. She was a 15-year-old Black girl in South Central Los Angeles, and in March of 1991, she enters a corner store called Empire Liquor Market, and it's owned by a Korean American family. And the shopkeeper there, the wife of the husband who owns the store, named Sujadu, sees Latasha in the store and kind of assumes that she's shoplifting a bottle of orange juice. And so
Mm,
Latasha and Sujadu have an altercation at the front counter. At the end of it, Latasha leaves the orange juice on the front counter, turns to leave, but Suja shoots her and kills her instantly there in the store. And so we often think about Rodney King as the spark of the
mhm,
LA uprising, but Latasha
mhm.
Harlins, that murder happened before that and was already kind of brewing some tensions and some upsetness in the community, along with just general economic disparities and all other sorts of systemic um, oppressions that kind of fueled the uprising. But we often forget Latasha's story, and then we also forget her life before her murder. I think of it in the same way we think of Tamir Rice and uh,
Mhm.
Breonna Taylor, like all of these stories, they just fixate on the death and we kind of lose sight of the life. And so I was interested in writing towards her life, but also towards just Black girlhood in general, towards my life, towards the life of all Black women. And so I would say this book is primarily that project, the project of giving life to our stories and our voices.
And that's so powerful that you did that, because as I was thinking and preparing, I thought about, of course, Breonna Taylor. And I recently was at the museum, the National Museum of African American History in DC, and they actually have the Breonna Taylor painting that Amy Sherrill did. But
Wow.
then they also have, like her story is told in words. So it made me think of your work, because we see this beautiful portrait, but then we also learn some of her story of who she was before what happened on that day. I also think of my soror. I'm wearing my blue and gold today, but my soror, and of course the name left me just as I was about to say it, Sandra Bland.
Yeah.
Same thing, we know about what happened in that day or the days leading to, why she was in Texas at that time, but we don't think of the whole person. So I appreciate the fact that you told a little bit of story about who she was, what happened before, and even some of the things that happened after.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much there, and there's not a lot of scholarship on Latasha Harlins, not a lot about who she was. I owe a lot of credit to one book that exists that I came across by Dr. Brenda Stevenson, which goes into Latasha Harlins's life, also goes into Sujadu's life, and then the life of the judge who proceeded over the case. And so that book kind of focuses on these three women and a girl, like at the center of this massive event in U.S. history. Um, and so, yeah, I think it's just important that we celebrate the life and the potential of children, especially like that are
Mm-hmm.
taken from us by like white supremacist violence, because I think that especially there's a section in the book where I write essays about going to LA, and
Mm-hmm.
I see Latasha Harlins' mural and a poem that was written like a month before her death. And so all the potential that Latasha saw in her own life that just wasn't able to be fulfilled, but there's joy in that. There's joy in remembering that. And so just kind of finding some joy in
Mm-hmm.
our memory of those we lose, I think is important too. So writing this was a grieving process, but also a process where I'm trying to find joy in the memories we do have of others.
Right, and it also leads me back to the cover of the book, actually, because on the cover it's like a mother or auntie or an older relative with beautiful nails who is like grooming the hair of a child and like sit of a young girl who's sitting in front of her, and just thinking of those stories, and actually some of your poems speak to that relationship as well. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, this book actually began with the first or the second poem in the book, which begins this dialogue between an aunt and a niece, and they're in that exact position, like the niece is getting her hair done. And
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm just fascinated with that tradition of kind of getting your hair done, like someone taking time out of their day to beautify you. But that process of getting your hair done, it's one of struggle. You know, you got to sit a certain way, you got to make sure your head is tilted a certain way. It's exhausting for the person doing the hair, especially if it's braids.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in those hours that are spent, stories are told, connection is built. And so I always say I think of Black girlhood as being made up of years and years of those hours with
Mm-hmm.
my elders. And so um, for me, I think the scene of getting your hair done, the stories that can be told in that intimate moment are just so interesting to me. And so I think one of those stories is kind of like the race talk, like when
Right.
we sit down and kind of explain the vulnerabilities of Blackness to our children. So I thought of that story, and then I thought of the intimate space of getting your hair done, and so kind of paired those together um, as a dialogue that kind of runs through the first part of the book. And so I was really wanting the cover to speak to that.
Mm-hmm.
And I came across this photo on Instagram, and I was like, okay, we got to reach out to the photographer for this photo. So I'm so glad we got permission for this image. So many people love this image. I love it. I think it's
Yes.
for the book. And so I just feel very appreciative that I get to have something that is representative of the work inside.
Right. It's that, and then it speaks to the universality of the story. Because even though the work itself, much of the work centers Latasha Harlins, and what you find out about her, and the other women that were involved in her life. It speaks to just the fact that Latasha Harlins could be any one of us.
Yes. Hmm. I love that. I think that that's so important, kind of bringing everything back to ourselves and how we interact with ourselves and our humanness. I think looking into Latasha showed me a lot about myself. So I think I'm appreciative of writing this book because I think it helped me come alive in a certain way. It's my first book, so in some ways it's taught me how to write and like what I want to write about, what I want to be remembered for. And
Mhm.
so I just think the book took a lot of research. So it's like I was writing while I was learning. So it definitely was a back and forth process that kind of made me reflect on the universality of her story um, and just how much it's important to kind of keep Latasha and everyone in mind.
Right, right. That is so true. Keeping them in mind, and that we don't forget.
Yeah.
That we don't forget, because not that we have, we care just as much about our sons and our husbands and brothers and all of that, but a lot of times the stories of women are relegated to the background
Mhm.
or are taken as seriously, especially with Black girls. They are seen as adults at a young age, just all the different things that happen with girls, and even as Black women. We've seen some things in the news of late. I'm thinking specifically of Meg Thee Stallion, how people are kind of coming for her as a Black woman. So it's wonderful for you as a Black woman to be able to center, let's say that particular story, but it also tells a larger story. You also mentioned a lot of other Black women writers in your writing. So tell us a little bit about those sisters that you pay honor to.
Yeah, and what I like about conversations like this and bringing up those things is that I think there's a way in which I think the names of Black women writers and those that came before me kind of enter the book. They kind of just found their way in there. Toni K. Bambara, Toni Morrison, the epigraph by Camilla Aisha Moon. Um, I think it's just the way in which these Black writers have shown me, how to write about Black womanhood, Black girlhood. I talk a lot about Alice Walker and her search for Zora Neale Hurston's unmarked grave, and how she kind of talks about that in the essay Looking for Zora. So you follow her as she goes to Eatonville, Florida. She talks to certain people. She tries to find where Zora's buried. She comes across people who have never heard Zora Neale Hurston's name. And it mirrored so much of what I found when I went to LA. And so I was able to immediately kind of call on Alice Walker's journeys and kind of see myself through her work. Um, I have like a favorite Toni K. Bambara essay, a favorite Toni K. Bambara quote that um, is this essay called "The Education of a Storyteller," and I think when I teach creative writing, I always want to teach that essay like as an introduction to what it means to be a storyteller, especially as a Black woman, like all of what you're carrying and the responsibility that you have to tell a story. Um, I think that there's a part in that essay that's really interesting to me. It's basically a grandmother talking to her granddaughter in the beginning of this essay, and I think the granddaughter says she tells the grandmother that she knows something that a lot of people don't know. It's like knowledge, and her grandmother says to her, "Well, if you're the only one that knows it, then you don't really know it. Like your people need to know it.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know anything if your people don't know it." And so that being important as a storyteller, that I only know as much as my people know, and kind of bringing my people into the fold and not holding knowledge and not holding things, and kind of looking at writing as a community practice. So I think when I talk about Black women and Black women writers, it's kind of me like showing my community, showing the women who came before me, and who usher me through the writing.
Mm-hmm. And that is so powerful that you said it, because we were talking about the art earlier, and I mentioned to you that like the pictures and the paintings, the things you see behind me are ones that I did, but the one that's like right here, the white with all the colors, that was actually an homage I did to Intozaki Shange with the different colors. So it's just so important for us to remember them and remember the people that inspire us and the work that they've done, because they have, kind of set the stage. And just like we don't want people like Latasha Harlins or Renisha McBride or Sandra Bland to be forgotten, we also don't want to forget the great women writers. So, Alon, since you are now a part of the canon of great women writers, do you have an excerpt or anything you'd like to share with us this evening?
Yes. I will share a poem. Okay. And a lot of poems in the book don't have titles, so I just start reading.
Right.
Yes. Okay. Everything that I've ever done, I keep in a jar marked innocent so that men can't touch it. Most flies tire of gossip they've prayed to be on the wall of. They roll such funky eyes, yawning over grown folks' most beautiful business. I sit with hands tied in a lie behind my own ass, a patient Afro donkey. I am the only trick alive and with eyes who likes outgrown acrylics, and who likes it when wind blows a water fountain show onto a sidewalk in a park the size of paradise. I think righteous confetti. Yesterday I am 26 and the home he will rape me in has not been built yet. Catching my fat reflection in an hourglass, I don't seem capable of creating what I have, a fear with proportions the size of disaster. Paradise and disaster are the exact same size for me. My fear is a park, and inside of her, a water fountain blows its show onto styrofoam boardwalks. The house she'll find me tripping in has not been built, yet it's gorgeous and owned by men who touch jars marked capable. I know facts about ancient Troy and one popular myth about Trojans. If you carry one, you won't need it. If you leave it, you'll seem clean or childishly kind. I kill a fly minding its business on a sidewalk inside of me today. Why? I know I'll enjoy the music. As a mother of something black, I owe flies nothing. Nothing. I owe nothing. Remember that.
Beautiful, beautiful. And that gives us some insight into one of your writing styles because actually you have several. We get to see your talent in a multitude of ways. You know, poetry, as I mentioned, prose. One of the other things that I enjoyed in the story is kind of like some of there are some reviews in there as well.
Yes. Yeah, there are some Yelp reviews. And when I started to think about kind of the way that stories of prejudice and racism are kind of passed along, it's usually word of mouth, but also in the digital age, the one place you can kind of get these narratives, especially about like Black beauty supply stores and anti-Blackness that happens in those settings, it's in a Yelp review. And so I kind of, in the same way that I was interested in the FBI's most wanted list as a form, as like a like a space where Black identity is perceived in a certain way. I was also interested in Yelp reviews as a form. And so I kind of started researching on Yelp. I would go to Black beauty supply stores that were owned by Asian American business owners and kind of see the reviews and see what people were talking about. So I took those reviews and then I was inspired by them and kind of wrote my own review and kind of used some of the same language. So a lot of the reviews are from Black women who have faced prejudice in Asian-owned businesses. I have one in here that's from an Asian American woman who's talking about having an issue in a Black braiding salon. So kind of having both sides, I think, is interesting to see in the Yelp review form. Yeah.
Right. I thought that was really unique, and you are so right because if we look at like going back to Latasha for a moment, what happened to her wasn't during the time that we have now, social media, where things can be passed along, where people can say, "Oh, don't go here" or "Don't go there" or "I was treated badly here or there." But to fast forward to today, where that happens a lot. You know, we've both seen cases where maybe people don't even live in the same city. All it takes is somebody that, you know, they believe in and they believe their story and they'll start putting the reviews, whether it's on Facebook or, you know, so that's something that says a lot. But, you know, in this particular case, because you are talking about relationships between Blacks and the Asian community, it stands out even more because a lot of us who have been to those businesses had bad experiences.
Yeah. And so to me, I think that was kind of where the book really began. It was really an interest in Black beauty supply stores. And then as it went to Latasha Harlins, of course, that instance happened in a corner store. So it kind of shifted. But I think going back to the cover, um, it's evoking the Black beauty supply store. And so the Black beauty supply store also kind of shows up throughout the work in some maybe more subtle ways. But I think as a child, hearing of those instances of prejudice and experiencing them myself, it was kind of the first time I understood white supremacy to be something that could happen without white people being in the room.
Right.
It's something that manifests between communities of color. And so I think discovering that as a young child is kind of confusing because it's kind of, I think you would assume that being of color would kind of assume this solidarity or this unity. And so the nuances of that relationship were just really interesting to me and have been interesting to me since I was a child. So it's interesting how I have come back to that topic in this book. And in a way, writing it was me figuring that out. Like, what is that? Where does that come from? What's true about it and what's not true about it? Especially in history, there's a lot in our history between Black and Asian American communities where there is unity.
Mm-hmm.
Even before the LA riots, there were organizations in LA like the Black Korean Alliance that were all about making sure the relationship was strong between the communities. And so, as much data as we have that there's tension between the communities, there's just as much data that there's solidarity. And so, I also wanted to make sure that that was explored in the book as well.
Mm-hmm. And it's important to do that because, there's never just one story. There are always multiple stories. But unfortunately, even just with the general news, we always hear the bad stuff. We
Absolutely.
don't necessarily hear about the things that are good when people are working together. But, just thinking about, the hair places, beauty supplies. I will admit, I am not a person that frequents beauty supply stores.
Mhm.
I am not usually places that I go to get my hair braided, they have it there, so I don't have to go and pick it up.
Yeah.
And, being in the Atlanta area, I'm fortunate that there are enough Black-owned stores, that I have access to. It's same with getting my nails done. I go to a Black-owned nail salon. So, it does provide for a different experience, but then that also speaks to access because sometimes, a person may not be able to hop in a car and make a decision to go to one place versus another place. If they want to get these services done or if they need to pick up products, they go to what's convenient for them.
Yeah. I think that's an important thing because it feels like sometimes, depending on our access, those stores are our only options, and then therefore discrimination and othering and prejudice is the only option. And so, living with that day to day, that level of scrutiny, that level of being like under surveillance, how that impacts a life over time,
Mm.
just especially a child. And so, I think that that is especially important to think about the way economic access and race and all those things intersect to make these situations what they are.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's definitely something that I considered as I was looking into this work.
Mm-hmm. And well, not to give much away. Well, this isn't like a traditional book, so excuse me, so it's not so much spoilers. But excuse me, even in one of the reviews, it speaks to, say, a person like myself saying, "Oh, I'm going to go to the Black business and not go over there," and then maybe not necessarily having the best experience at the Black business
Mhm.
either. And that's a thing that comes up.
Right. I love it's funny because there was one version of this book that ended on that review because I feel like
Mm.
the last page and it was because this is the irony of it, like the
Right.
cyclical nature of it, that we can face this kind of disrespect in Asian owned businesses, Black owned businesses. Like it's just like it kind of never ends, like the cyclical nature of this experience. So I find that interesting. I was interested when I came across that review. And when I got that review from Yelp, it's basically word for word what that review was.
Mm-hmm.
So I found it to be ironic.
Right. Right. We're like, well, maybe they're not so bad over there after all.
Mhm.
But that just we're talking about, beauty supply stores or, nail salons or, corner stores, whatever the case may be. But then that's just like one piece. Just think about the other spaces where we might feel like we don't have another choice. So we just deal with the microaggressions or the aggressions or the disrespect or whatever, because it's like, well, this is the only choice that I have, or we feel like that's the only choice that we have.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that um, is such an important thing that I like try to write about in the poems. I think another aspect, especially because we're thinking about like Black women, Black girls, or women of color in general, the way that racism and sexism intersect and make our lives a particular sort of oppression. And to me, it was because we're talking about Latasha Harlins, who's a Black girl, but then also Sujadu, who's a Korean woman,
Mm-hmm.
faces her own oppressions as well. Like there's a sensitivity to kind of both of their stories, especially the way that male aggression shows up in both of their lives. Because Sujadu was abused by her husband, and then Latasha Harlins was sexually assaulted by a counselor at the local recreation center. And so I kind of write in one section of the book towards like sexual violence. And that poem I read comes from that section.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that, I'm also like navigating the ways that both the Black and Asian American community, or communities of color, women of color, kind of face those in similar ways, not identical ways, but in a similar terrain. And I think that's also important for solidarity too, just to see the ways that racism and sexism interact in our lives.
And that is so true. That's true. Because if we knew more of each other's stories, 'cause I say this even like when I interview authors from Africa or other parts of the diaspora, if we knew more of each other's stories and understood more about the ways that we're more alike than we are different in many instances, that would go a long way in bridging some of these gaps. And to think about the fact that, she was an abused woman. She had her own issues that she was dealing with, and that may have played, not excusing what happened, but that may have played into some of her fear and her in that moment feeling like, I have to take power. I can't take power back in this area of my life, but I can express power in this other space in my life.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I do think that there are ways that, like, the intersections of oppression just trickle into various aspects of our actions. And so that's very true. I think another place in the book where I try to kind of show the ways that our experiences compare and contrast are on those Black pages in the book, where there's a line down the middle, and one side is kind of this list of Black experiences throughout history, and then the other side, Asian American experiences throughout American history. And so that's also a place where I'm just navigating the ways we're similar, the ways we're different, especially in the lens of whiteness, like how whiteness kind of sets us against one another, how it perceives us. And so that's another form. And I don't even know what I call those. They're like lines. Sometimes I call them timelines, but yeah, like just another form, because I think that this is another place in terms of, if I think about this as a visual, I don't feel like there's something I could write that could really get to it as much as seeing a line and seeing this back and forth. Being able to read that in any direction, any way, and kind of giving readers a way to just experience these random kind of terminologies, and make a narrative from there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have a question, because of course this book does center Black women, but because you are speaking about the Asian community as well, did you have any interactions with them in putting the story together, or how did that play into writing the poems and the other work within the book?
Yeah, that was something I was always considering, because I think as a Black woman, I can speak to my experience. I can't speak to any others. And so I was always cautious of making sure I wasn't speaking to any other experiences but my own. Even Latasha's experience, I never want to write a poem in her voice.
Right.
I want to just be kind of saying I'm observing and I'm taking this information and making art that speaks to me. So a lot of the work for this book was research. So it wasn't a lot of like one-on-one interviews or anything like that. Just kind of reading and then reflecting by writing poetry or creating visuals. So most of the book, the entire book, was really written after reading books, watching documentaries. And then at the end, I had already had the book. The book had already won the prize when I had gone to LA, and then really went to Latasha's gravesite, her middle school, and all these places. And I really went there kind of like to kind of soothe this sort of imposter syndrome that I had, because I'm writing about Latasha Harlins, and she was killed before I was born. Never lived in LA. And so there's a lot in that I feel distant from the topic already. And so there's only so much I can really feel in books and in documentaries. And when I go to LA, I'm going 30 years later. So I'm not even able to ever go back to that true moment. But I wanted to get as close as possible. And so going to LA and kind of, as I see it, kind of going to these ghosts of locations and just feeling the way that Latasha is still present in these places where she was once alive. So that's kind of how I think of that research. And even on that trip, I only speak to one person.
Okay.
I speak to an Uber driver, and then I speak to a woman that's outside of the middle school. And these are very short conversations, but to me, the real work was standing in these places and feeling. Even in the research, kind of like reading something and then feeling something and then being able to write something. Um, but it was important to me once I had a draft of the manuscript to have it read by friends, people across various backgrounds, because I did want to make sure I was doing everything with care because this is such a sensitive topic. So it was very important for me to have editors, to have people in fellowship programs I was in, and then personal friends read it. And I got a sense that everyone kind of felt that it was done with care. And so at that point, I was like, okay, this is ready to be in the world.
Right, and it is such a powerful work. Another thing that you do speak to, and it kind of goes back to the cover as well. We talk about Latasha's upbringing, about the aunt that pretty much had took care of her, and the things that she was going through, kind of fighting for, justice for her niece, and just all of the challenges and the way that it kind of wore her down after a while as well.
Yeah. Aunt Denise really became like a social justice advocate, changed her entire life to devote it to making sure that no one ever forgot about Latasha and that this would never happen to another child again. And so that sort of love is just so Black. It's so Black woman. It's so Black mother. And I think it's just important as I think about the ways that I talk about Black women writers in the book, the way that there's an aunt in the book. And I think that there was the aunt in the book before I even talked about Aunt Denise. So it was one of those moments where I was like, something I had already written, like, and then something I learned just fits in perfectly. And so I'm so glad that I'm able to kind of speak to Aunt Denise and her work, and just the ways that we, the ones who are left on Earth after people are killed, it's our responsibility to kind of be those storytellers and to be the people who kind of carry that legacy on and make sure that our children are not forgotten. And so I feel like I take that responsibility as a writer. I think people take that responsibility as social justice workers or any way that you can in your life. And so I admire Aunt Denise a lot for the way that she really devoted her life and used her grief in a way that honored her niece.
And that's a true. It's interesting that you say that. I don't know if you've seen Wakanda Forever yet.
Not yet, not yet.
Well, no spoilers there either. But that's something that comes up as well when people are grieving. How do you deal with that grief? Do you take it and do you stay angry and do things that may be destructive, or do you take it and use it in a way that's more powerful that can pay honor to that person and help their memory to live on? So those are things to think about. But when reading about Aunt Denise, I also thought about people like Fannie Lou Hamer who just gave it all, and were carrying burdens and were dealing with their own health issues and how it was wearing them down. And you speak to that as well. So yes, it's important that we care about others and that we fight the power, fight for rights, fight for all of these things, but that we're also remembering that we need to care for ourselves as well in the midst of that.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. Yeah, because I talk in this section about the way that the work we put in to combat racial injustice directly affects our health and like our life expectancy as a Black people. And so it's just that the stress of being Black Like, how do you alleviate that stress? I think that also goes back to access. Like, who has the access to alleviate that stress? I think it's just so it's really like sad to think about the fact that there's not a lot of control you have over the way that white supremacy just infiltrates. But I do think it's really important to find ways to see ourselves and to heal and to give space to the time that we need to, and not kind of be, because we got to be present for ourselves in order to be present for others. And so I definitely think that's central to any kind of social justice work that you're doing. And so, yes, I think writing about Aunt Denise dying of congestive heart failure, and knowing that there has to be some correlation with stress and the work of trying to keep Latasha's memory alive, that kind of just coincides with that health.
What is one of the things, or what things do you want people to take away from the body of work, both the visual art as well as the poems and the prose? What are you hoping that people will take away from it?
I hope that this book starts conversations. I know that this conversation about allyship, solidarity, tension, all that has been going on for years, well before this book was written, but I think it's a conversation that should continue. And hopefully we can think about the ways we want our togetherness to manifest. So I hope that that kind of conversation comes up. I hope that Black girls and Black women see themselves in the work and feel seen and validated and understood. I hope that this book feels like a memorialization of Latasha, but all Black girls and Black women that we've lost. And I'm also excited about the ways that people will take away things that I never expected. I love talking to readers, and they'll say, like, a certain line means a certain thing to them that I had never considered. So there's a way where when I get to speak to readers, I get to kind of see my book in a way I've never seen it before. Like, my book is being given back to me in a completely new way, and I'm able to read it again. I think another interesting thing is I have not sat down to read this book front to back since kind of turned it in the final draft. So it's like, I want to sit down and read this book again and kind of experience it. I can never experience it brand new, but like as new as possible. So I'm excited to see what my takeaways are coming back and reading it for myself.
Right, because I can imagine, you're with all the research and things that you did, and now having the opportunity to see it in its totality, to hear what other people are saying, I can imagine it would be a different, it would read differently than it would have been when you actually sat down and write it.
Yeah. I love kind of, especially in interviews and in book reviews, just seeing the ways people piece the story together and make sense of what's happening. And I like that because I think I wrote it in a way where I wanted to leave space for it to be kind of accessed in many different ways. That's why I don't have a lot of poem titles. I kind of want things to just flow together. I don't know when things end or begin necessarily. And so I like the collage feel of the book itself. I think it mirrors the way that oppression and violence and white supremacy is a collage that doesn't really have a beginning and end. It doesn't have a lot of logic to it. So there's a way that I want people to feel their way through the book. And to the same degree that I kind of felt my way through the writing of the book. So the way it's put together is kind of a way to mirror the process of putting this together, of trying to make sense of it, of trying to figure out what it is I wanted to say.
One of the other things that kind of came up for me, you did not mention it, but thinking back to Alice Walker going to Eatonville and looking for Zora and going through the process of getting, a headstone and all those things for Zora Neale Hurston. and some similar things that went on with Latasha and what happened. It made me think about the importance of even our burial sites, even the places where we are being memorialized, and understanding that sometimes things get bulldozed over, or all kinds of things happen, that those places aren't always protected. And I guess just for us to be more aware of what's going on, and do what we can to make sure that that part doesn't get wiped away either.
Yeah, I always think of, for context, for listeners, Latasha, when she was buried, there was like a span of years in which the cemetery started to exhume bodies and put them in a mass pile so that they had enough land to continue to bury more bodies and keep making money as a cemetery. And so it's thought that Latasha was one of the bodies that was dug up and kind of discarded. And so I think of that as a second death, like to be disrespected again, to be killed in life and then to be disturbed and killed in death too. So there's a lot of grief there. And so going to the cemetery, seeing that it's not kept up very well. I couldn't find Latasha's headstone. I'm sure it's there. I've seen pictures of it online, but the writing really became about my search for her and trying to find the headstone, but also realizing that if I find the headstone, I'm not finding her. And so like this sense of an absence and the grief in that, and never really knowing where she is, just stands out to me. And it is sad to think, like, yeah, Zora Neale Hurston, like such a prolific writer, would not have a marked grave. And that, no one would think to really do that besides when Alice Walker goes and tries to attempt to find her. Because I think that's so interesting that it's first you got to find where she might be.
Mm-hmm.
You can't even confirm that. So that lack of certainty, there's a grief there.
Yes.
And I think about that a lot. And how important it is to kind of honor us in death.
Mm-hmm.
It's like with the lack of control over cemeteries, like
Mm-hmm.
they're like my grandparents are buried. There was one time we went to the cemetery and there had been like tractor marks that like kind of like ran over the burial plot, and like how devastating it is to see that.
Mm-hmm.
It is. I think I just have a really interesting relationship to cemeteries and just
Mm-hmm.
the lack of control you have over how your loved ones treated in a cemetery. So yeah, it's definitely a traumatic, and important that we do the best we can to kind of keep those spaces sacred.
Yes. Yes. That, and you mentioned, I mentioned that you went to school here in Atlanta, and because you have a familiarity, I went to one of the major cemeteries here locally on a tour a few months ago, and it was like, well, at one point in time it was a black section, and and then eventually they opened it up where people could go anywhere, and just some of the things that people had to go through, and other times to even get blacks buried in certain parts of the cemetery. So, the whole thing of white supremacy and all that shows up even in the afterlife, depending on where you are, and just the willingness for people to discard bodies and not care where they place them, that just speaks a lot to, capitalism for one, as well as, well, if this is this black section, they're not that important anyway, so we'll just, so that's just something for us to be mindful of.
Yeah, absolutely. Because Paradise Memorial Park, most of the people buried there are Black and brown people, and so the lack of care there is for a very obvious reason. And like, yeah, I think about that a lot.
Mm-hmm. So what do you have going on next? Are you working on another book of poetry, or what do you got going on? Or more artwork, or a combination?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that a lot of the poems in this book existed in another manuscript that I had been working on. And so I'm thinking about returning to that one. And that one's more about my family history. It's more personal. So I think it requires a certain reflection period, a certain like internal processing that takes time. And so I don't think I was ready to write that book. I went ahead and wrote this one first. And I think I was ready for this one in a way that I wasn't the other. But I'm excited to kind of go back to that and see where I am now and what I have to say about that now. But there are always ideas in my head. Like I feel like I come up with ideas for poems or books. But I think my writing process is usually I write poems. I just write them. And then eventually I have a bucket of them. And then I'm thinking, okay, what do they have in common? What are they saying to one another? And is this a book or what is this? And so that probably will take some years, but I'm excited to see what unfolds from that writing.
Yeah, and I can imagine when you're dealing with things that are more personal, that's definitely more of you have to, because in the back of your mind, like, okay, if I say this, how's this going to impact this person, or all those sorts of things. I see you have Kendra Allen's book behind you. I've talked to her a couple of times, and that's something she spoke to. Okay, yeah, I got to deal with this, and this is my story, and yeah, people might not always like it or understand it, or whatever the case may be. But just getting to the place of being able to do that.
Yeah, I love Kendra's work, and I definitely think it's a process putting something out so personal. I think there's a lot in Concentrate that's personal, but I think to write about family in a very direct way, you're thinking about what your family thinks about that, and you're thinking about what the public and the readers might think about that, how they'll access your personal story. I think that I'm excited to see what I have to say about those things. So it also just takes a lot of like time with the material. I think it can show up as poetry. It could also show up as nonfiction. I'm glad that writing this book has shown me all the different ways that I'm able to tell a story.
Yes.
There are different modes for different things I want to say. Sometimes if something's a little difficult, maybe I'll lean on a picture instead. Or, I won't write about it in a direct way, but I'll have a poem that kind of hints to it. Or if I need to say something directly, I'm going to write it in an essay in a kind of direct way. And so I think that writing Concentrate also kind of helped me lay a foundation for the way I write and what a book can do.
Well, I definitely appreciate it. As I told you earlier, I really enjoyed reading it, sat down and read it in the context of a couple of hours. And I know I'm going to go back because there's just so much in there, so many things to just think about and ponder, whether it pertains to, our relationship with the Asian community or us as women, as a more mature woman, the things that I might say to the cousins and nieces and girls in my life, ways to prepare them for different things, in the world and in life and all of that. So it's definitely a lot to reflect. Let me see. We have a comment. It might be too long. I'm going to try to put it up. Let's see here. It's fascinating. Your spin on the tragic history of the missing and most wanted. I have hundreds of mailers of missing children and teens from the 80s and 90s. I can't dispose of them. Seems disrespectful. Yeah.
I love that because I think a lot about the work in this book as a work that deals with archives. And so like just the missing people flyers, it's like an archive of things that, it felt like something needed. I wanted to repurpose them. I wanted to like think about them in a way that humanizes or calls out the ways that those flyers are dehumanizing. So I think it's when you have certain things in your archive and you don't want to throw them away, like spending time with those items, figuring out what they have to say about you and like what is it about them that you're holding on to them. And it never has to become anything.
Right.
It literally could just be very sacred to you. I keep everything. Like I keep movie ticket stubs. I keep like all sorts of things that I feel like there's something here that just is so valuable to me, and nothing ever comes of it, but it's just part of how I see myself or how I see what's important to me. So I love that you keep those mailers.
Now, I was listening to what you were saying, but I was trying to pull up one of the pictures is kind of hard to see because of the glare, but this is like an example of some of the art that's in there.
Yeah.
The collage work that's there. And it's very interesting. It might be hard to tell because I said the way the light is, but it's like, it's collage. So it's like cut and paste.
Yeah. You know? Yeah. It's very, it's kind of like, just the process for that was I printed them out on my printer out, and then took my phone and took a picture of them and used a scanner app. So it's also very kind of like just like I'm a novice at it. It's very new to me. And so even the way that it's put together is just like very simple. The way that kind of shows the navigation of it.
Right. And it is very powerful and adds to the work of concentrate. So thank you so much, Courtney. I appreciate you. I know we've been waiting to do this for quite a while. I think it might have been early part of this year when we first got this scheduled. So it's perfect timing. I'm so happy for this as your first official work out in the world, first official book, and I know that there's going to be a lot more. So in terms of activities, are there any places where you're going to be doing any live events that people can tap into around the country? Or
yes, you can find all of my tour events on my website, but the next place I'll be is here in Kansas City tomorrow at Rockhurst University, and then a couple weeks later I'll be in New York City. So very excited to see everyone, and thank you, Marcy. Like, I'm so happy to be part of the book club and just to spend time with you and your readers.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you, Courtney. And if you can hold on for a second, I'm going to do an announcement for the next book. Actually, next week it won't be here because it's holiday week, and I know people will be frying up turkeys and doing all kinds of other stuff. But just to announce the next book. So if you can hold on for just a moment, and I'll be right back to you. So everyone, thanks for joining us tonight. As always, I appreciate you. And this computer is doing something weird here. I appreciate you and your time for listening to Courtney. And I do hope that you go out and pick up a copy of Concentrate or order it online or however you get your books, because it is an important work and there's just so much richness in there and things for us to glean from her artistry. So by means of our next book, we will have on a return author. Vanessa Miller will be here to talk about what we found in Hallelujah. So she will be here in a couple of weeks, the week after the holiday, after Thanksgiving holiday. We'll be back with her for her second visit in this nice inspirational novel. So I'm looking forward to that. And in the meantime, in between time, you all take care. Have a safe holiday if you're traveling. If you don't celebrate, just enjoy being off if you have the time off with your family. And I look forward to seeing you again real soon. Thanks again for your time. Bye-bye.